Hello and welcome back, and thanks for watching. In this short video we're going to take a look at what is the correct order in which to carry out the processing steps in Lightroom or Camera Raw. Now Adobe sets out the order in which they think that you should do the processing, but is that the best way or is there a better way to do it? Let's jump in and take a look. So here we are in the Develop module in Lightroom, and the first thing we'll have a look at is that on the right hand side we have all of our development tools. Now one thing that you may not be aware of is that you can customize the order in which this is set up, and I've already done some of that because I've changed the order in which I work on things. But if you want to customize it for yourself, all you need to do is right mouse click anywhere on this spare space, click on customize panel order, and then you can move things up or down as you like. So for instance, if you wanted to move the effects up, you could put it up there, and then you can save that, and it will need you to relaunch Lightroom, and once that's done the panels will appear in the new order. So bear in mind that you can pretty much reorder everything that you want in that development panel, but here's the order in which I recommend we carry it out. So with the Lightroom relaunched, with that change in the panel order in place, let's have a look at the order in which Adobe prefers us to process the images. Now at the very beginning they give us the profile, and then at the very top we look at the white balance. Now there's a fundamental problem here, in that I'm looking at an image that is very underexposed, and it was photographed indoors under artificial light, so there's no way that I can adjust the color temperature without adjusting the tonality. So the obvious answer is, before you even think about adjusting the white balance, we need to look at our black and white points and get our exposure right. So the first thing I would be doing is I'd be looking at my black point, and in this case I'll be moving that quite a long way in so that I'm just about getting things not clipped on the dark end. And then obviously my whites, I've got a little bit of clipping on my whites, but if I look at that, it's really just the flames. So I'm not too concerned about that. That's going to be about right for me. In fact, I might even take it up a little bit higher. So having set our black and white point, we can then move the midtones, which Adobe still insists on calling exposure, and we can raise that level of tonality. So now we can start to see things in the image in the background, and we can start to think about how we would then adjust the white balance. Now we're not quite ready to look at the white balance yet, because there are a few other things that I would look at firstly, and in order to be able to make a proper assessment of the white balance, we'll carry those steps out first and then come back to the white balance. So certainly at this point I would be thinking about how much texture and clarity I want to add to the photograph, bearing in mind that this one was shot at 1600 ISO, so it's pretty noisy, and it's going to need some work later on to remove that noise and add back some detail. But certainly I would add some clarity and texture and just look at that. And obviously in this sort of situation I'm not going to need to apply any dehaze, but that's when you would probably apply that then. Now this is the way that I would suggest is the best way to assess the white balance. Let's come down and look at our vibrance, move it all the way to the right, and our saturation, so that we've now got the image as bright and saturated as it's possible to get. And so we can now start to see what the color cast is. Well, there's obviously quite a lot of red color cast in the image, so that we need to look at the color temperature. And if we move that color temperature slider all the way to the left, well obviously that's nothing like what we want. But as we move it a little bit away from that initial setting, we can start to see the colors come back into these different fabrics here. Whereas if I go back to where it was as shot, it's very red, but if I just bring it back enough, then I can have a look at the tint, and if I move that tint too far, you see it goes pretty wild. This is an extreme example, and that's why I'm using it. But once we have those settings, we can now make an assessment, and we'd reset the vibrance and saturation so that we've now got something that's looking a little bit more realistic. Obviously these candles or vats of yak butter in the foreground are going to be very yellow because they're a very warm flame, but certainly we've got the background looking a little bit more neutral. We could try and white balance on this small light fitting here, but because that's pretty well blown out, you won't be able to get a decent white balance from there. But certainly going through those few steps initially, we can then get a much better idea of white balance. So let's look at another image and see how that works. Now, just to give another example that's probably not quite as extreme as this one, let's look at another image here that was photographed with more or less the correct exposure, but the white balance is way off. And this was photographed in the rainforest in Tasmania, and you can see that there's quite a bit of colour cast here. It's way too magenta, but let's have a look at what we would do. So we'd start again, ignoring the white balance initially. Let's just look at the exposure. I think it's pretty close to being okay as is. Could do with a little more contrast, but we'll come back to that later. There are some shadow details that I would like to lift, so I could change that, and then I would have a little look at the black point and the white point, and once we pin those in position, they're not really going to move much. So let's just have a look at add a little bit of clarity and texture. And now let's do the same trick with the vibrance and saturation, and we can see what the color cast is. Well, firstly, as we could see initially, there's a massive magenta color cast in all of that foliage, and there's quite a lot of blueness in the trees, which means that the color temperature is too low. So let's increase the color temperature a little bit so that we get more of a bit of a natural look, bearing in mind that this is crazy oversaturated. And then let's bring that magenta cast back down until we get something that looks a little bit more realistic. And let's just bring those vibrance and saturation sliders back, and you'll see here that it's pretty well neutralized that color. So regardless of the image, if you take those few basic steps, adjust the tonality first, the black point to the white point, maybe a bit of contrast, some shadow detail, and then look at adjusting the white balance. Once you've got a decent exposure, you've got a much better chance of adjusting the white balance. But then in order to process the colors more to make it a bit more of a vibrant image, we're going to look at a different way of doing that. So now we've got an image where the white balance is pretty close to being right, and that's not to say that we may not go back and adjust it a little bit more later on. But the problem is the photograph's a bit flat and boring, and we're going to move that along a little bit and get some more colour into it. Now, you could be tempted just to go in and crank up the vibrance, and yes, that sort of works, but there's a better way. And the better way is to come down to the calibration tool. Now, if you've not reordered your panels in the develop module, calibration will be just about right at the bottom. But I've moved this up because this is a tool that I found to be very useful. Just make sure you're working on the current version of the process, version 6, and we have the three primary colors, and we have a tint. I'm not going to adjust the shadows. We're going to look at the blue, green and red primaries, and we're not going to touch the hue here. We're going to look at hue in another area. But firstly, what we would do is go to the blue primary, and we'll move that around. And you might be forgiven for thinking, well, if I'm just going to adjust the blues, it's only going to change the blues in the image, but not so. Let's take this all the way to the right, and you'll see that not only has it increased the saturation overall, but it's also brought out more green in those areas. Now, I'm going to be fairly aggressive with this, so I'm going to take that up fairly high, and that's already massively improved the colour in the image. And then what about the green primary? Well, let's have a look at that. What happens with that? Well, yes, you can see that if we go too far, everything becomes radioactive and it's way too crazy. But if we just bring that up a little bit, we'll end up with a little bit more vibrant colour. And bearing in mind that if you've not been to the Tasmanian wilderness areas, the mosses and lichens growing on the forest floor are really, really vibrant. And then let's look at the red primary. And if we go up, we'll see that all of these bits of foliage on the ground, they are all quite reddy browny, and by increasing that saturation, if we go too crazy, it's going to affect everything. As you see, if I slide it back and forward, it doesn't just affect the reds, but I can bring up the reds a little bit more in that. So I've gone into the calibration slider, and I've actually brought up the overall saturation by moving these sliders around. Now let's turn this off. That was before, and that's after. Now you're going to say that I've gone too far, this is too vibrant. Yes, of course it is. So the next thing we come up to is the color mixer panel, and we have 3 tabs: hue, saturation and luminance. Firstly, we're going to just have a look at the saturation, and you'll see here that yes, the greens are way too vibrant, so I'm going to bring them down. Now green is nearly always made up of mostly yellow, so if I just take the yellow vibrance down a little bit, you'll see that that will bring that down a little bit. The greens, yes, a small effect. What about the oranges? Well, there's a bit of orange in that reddy brown. I'm going to leave that as is. And what about the reds? Well, I've already boosted the reds. I don't need to do too much with those. What about the blues? There's some blues coming in. If I move that right up, you'll see on this tree trunk that it turns completely blue. We don't really want to bring any more blue into the image. So we've already changed the colors by using the calibration tools, and we've now fine-tuned some of those colors using the saturation tools, and every photograph will be slightly different, but we can also then look at amending the hues slightly. Now, as I said, the greens in this foliage are largely made up of yellows, so I can take the yellow slider and I have a hue adjustment. If I move it to the left, it will take it more towards the orange range, which I really don't want to do. Or if I move it to the right, it will take it a little bit more towards green. Now, you need to be fairly subtle with this, but just a little bit of adjustment here will work. And if I take the greens and move them back a little bit the other way, I can then get a slightly different look, very subtle, but a slightly different look to the colors. And likewise, we can do the same thing with the luminance. Let's just have a look at that yellow, and if I use the luminance slider, I can make the green areas much more vibrant or darker, lighter or darker. And likewise with the reds, I can make them brighter or darker. It's a little bit more subtle. Maybe the oranges, you'll see the difference there. So we've got a lot of tools that we can use to adjust the color, and actually the vibrance and saturation tools are really the least effective in doing all of that. So let's move on now and look at a couple of the other tools. Now, it might be at this point that you go back and have a look at it and think, well, I've actually overdone this a little bit, and you may want to fine-tune the white balance once you've tweaked that. I'm just looking at this now, and I think I'm probably going to go back and reduce the saturation of the yellows and the greens a little bit. It is a little bit hot, but of course the beauty of this is you can go backwards and forwards. The main thing is to get the order right in the first place. The next thing I may stop at is the tone curve, and I might decide that I can help this along the way by adding a little bit more contrast, although you just need to be careful. This is in the rainforest. We don't want it to be overdone, but of course you have the option of using the tone curve, and we can then improve the overall contrast of the image that way. And then let's go back and have a look at one of the other options on the panel here, and that is the color grading panel. Now this one can get you into all sorts of trouble if you're not careful with it, because you have 3 panels here. We have a midtones panel, a shadows and a highlights, and we can use this to subtly change the color balance between shadows, midtones and highlights. So let's have a look at the shadows. We might want to decide that we want the shadows to be a little bit cooler, and if I pull it all the way over to the edge, you'll see here that all of the darker areas have got quite a distinct blue cast. That's way too much, but sometimes a little bit of subtle adjustment. And let's have a look at the highlights. Well, maybe the highlights should be a little warmer. Let's just move those over a little warmer. And then the midtones, well, let's just warm those up a little bit too. So again, a little bit of movement on this panel makes quite a big difference. I've only done that fairly subtly. Let's be a little bit more aggressive. So for the purposes of illustration, yes, you could do that. In fact, I would probably reset all of these. I wouldn't do that on this particular image, but that's another option available to us. So having done all of that, we've now got the color in a pretty good shape. We've looked at contrast. We can modify that as we need to. Maybe I want those shadows to be a little lighter, and maybe I want to move that black point in a little bit more. But once we've got all of that correct, we've now got an area that we can work in where we're confident in the color, the white balance, and the overall tonality. So let's go back and have a look now at that other image that we processed earlier that had the high level of noise. And I've been fairly critical in the past of Adobe's approach to denoise and sharpening. So let's do the exercise and apply the denoise from Adobe Lightroom into the image. Now, I may have to speed this image, the processing up a little bit, because it does take a little while to process, but let's have a look at what Adobe thinks it can do. Here's the little panel. The problem is that when you're looking at this level of magnification, well, yes, we can see that it's certainly changed the amount of noise in it. So let's go ahead and enhance that, and it will go away and calculate what it's going to do, and it will bring the image back obviously as a DNG. And here we go, it's done that rather quickly. So let's have a look at the difference. This is the enhanced DNG version, and this was my other version, and unfortunately it's lost all those processing that I did, so we'll have to go back and reset all of that. Let's go back. Yeah, that's much better. You can see that there's a lot of noise in the image, and Adobe's done a pretty reasonable job, I have to say. They must have improved it a little bit. And then of course, once we've done our denoising, we can play around with the detail. Now, knowing that this was taken in fairly difficult lighting, I'm not going to be able to do a lot of sharpening. We'll just have to try and work with what we've got, and we'll apply the masking, so we're only getting the sharpening on the edges. And let's have a look at the difference. I've just added a little bit of detail. You can't really see that on here, but if we go back and look at our original image, you can see that there's a lot of noise in it. So I'll have to eat my words a little bit here and say that, well, Adobe's improved the denoising in Adobe Lightroom and obviously Camera Raw to the point where it is actually now reasonably usable, whereas before it was pretty awful. So we've processed our image, we've applied some denoising, we've adjusted the colors and the tonality. Then of course, if we want to do any further work, we can take it into Photoshop or export it directly from here. Now, bearing in mind that when you create a file using the denoise option in Lightroom, here we are back in the library panel, you'll see here that it comes back as a reasonable sized file, and I think using Adobe's conversion to DNG, it compresses the file. But if you use something like Topaz to do the denoising and sharpening, which I still think it does a very good job, the file size does get increased quite substantially. So there is a little bit of a potential downside to using the outside processing, but certainly working with the Adobe version now, it is improved considerably. It does seem to lose a little bit of the processing that we've done. As you can see here, the DNG that's come back has lost all of that processing, so we sometimes then have to go in and copy those settings from one and paste it back into the DNG, which is a bit of a strange thing that it does. So if we go to the copy panel, we can copy all of the options. I'm not entirely sure what I've done here, so let's copy everything. No, actually, let's not copy everything, because on the original one we haven't done the detail, but we've done everything else. So we'll copy those settings, go back to the Adobe DNG file and paste them in, and so we've now got the initial processing steps. And you can see that by doing the tonality adjustments initially and then bringing that white balance in, we've actually managed to achieve a white balance that looks quite acceptable. So I hope all that's been useful. Bear in mind that the order in which Adobe suggests you process is not necessarily the best. This is my take on it. Let me know in the comments what you think, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.